Today is Friday, 17th January 2025, and in some respects, the most important news today is the arrival in Moscow of the Iranian president, Masoud Pezeshkian, and the forthcoming signature, not yet signed as of the moment of making this video, but his forthcoming signature and signing of the strategic partnership agreement between Russia and Iran. And we've had extensive television footage of Pezeshkian's arrival in Moscow. He was received at Moscow airport by a strong delegation, which included the energy minister and a deputy foreign minister. He's been to the Kremlin. He's had a meeting there with Putin. We've had lots of pictures of the two men smiling as they meet each other. And he's also visited the tomb of the unknown soldier close to the Kremlin, where he has laid a wreath. And we've had some comments from Putin and Pezeshkian, which have been provided to us also by the Kremlin website. And, well, I'm not going to read them out because I don't think that they add very much to what we already know. Putin does say that we continue on major projects, including projects in the field of nuclear energy. We have other potential projects in the field of energy, and there are good prospects in the field of logistics. That means, of course, transportation corridors. And he says that it will be a comprehensive agreement. This is Putin who says this, which will cover all kinds of issues, tourist exchanges. There's been an increasing increase in trade, transport, communications, that kind of thing. Now, the reference to nuclear projects is interesting. And when you come to Pezeshkian's comments, he mentions that there is agreements on the construction of a nuclear power plant, which is very good news. Now, I've had a number of people contact me over the last couple of days, and they've all expressed doubts that the Russians would have set a condition for the signing of this strategic partnership agreement, that Iran does not acquire or move forward with the development of nuclear weapons. Many have said that this would be completely uncharacteristic for the Russians to do. The Russians supposedly never do these sort of things. As a matter of fact, I can say for a fact that that is wrong. I remember reading some years ago that way back in the 1960s, the Russians got wind of the fact that even at that time, we're talking about the mid-1960s, North Korea was considering acquiring nuclear weapons, and the Soviets made it known to the North Koreans that they not only strongly disapproved, but that if North Korea did proceed with nuclear weapons, it would affect relations, but that if North Korea were to abandon that quest, then the Soviets would be willing to extend their nuclear umbrella to cover North Korea. And at that time, the North Korean leader, Kim Il-sung, accepted that this was the Soviet condition for further cooperation between his country and what was, of course, at that time, the Soviet Union. And in some ways, you can see parallels with Iran. The Russians, apparently, though neither Pezeshkian nor Putin are mentioning this in their introductory comments, but the Russians apparently are going to help Iran beef up its air defenses. But I'm confident that in return, they will have sought and obtained assurances from Iran that it will not move forward with a nuclear weapons program. Now, the fact that the Russians have agreed to build a nuclear power station in Iran, I think settles the matter. It is inconceivable that the Russians would agree to do such a thing if Iran had not given them categorical assurances that they would not pursue a nuclear weapons program and would not seek to acquire nuclear weapons. The Russians would, under no circumstances, share nuclear technology if they believed that Iran really did intend to acquire nuclear weapons. So there it is. I am sure that this is the case. Of course, this does not mean that Iran will never acquire nuclear weapons. No one can ever say this for certain, but for the moment at least, it looks to me as if this agreement is off the table. Iranian officials, as I've discussed in previous programs, did hint at the possibility of Iran moving forward with a nuclear weapons program some months ago. I suspect that this was part of the complex negotiation to agree this treaty with the Russians. Pezeshkian, in his comments, mentioned the fact that there were details in the treaty that needed ironing out even on his arrival in Moscow, which shows what a protracted and complicated process sorting out this treaty has been. In fact, Putin mentions that agreeing the treaty, agreeing to all its various particular aspects, has taken a very long time, just to say. But anyway, it looks as if we're now there. There will be a treaty. It will involve significant economic cooperation between Russia and Iran. It is overwhelmingly likely that it will involve a security dimension as well. I have been told that it includes Russia supplying air defense systems to Iran and integrating Iran's air defense system with its own, which I think is quite likely. It includes, as we now see, Russia building a nuclear power station in Iran. Of course, there is already a nuclear power station in Iran at Bushehr, originally started by a German company in the 1970s during the reign of the Shah of Iran, but only completed after Russian assistance was sought as a result of an incredibly prolonged and protracted reconstruction program. As I understand it, it turned out that the nuclear power station, the German technology that had been used at the plant in Bushehr, was incompatible with Russian nuclear technology, and large areas of the uncompleted plant had to be completely redeveloped in order to bring it into line with Russian standards, just to say. But anyway, it includes the creation of a nuclear power plant, another nuclear power plant, and as I said, I'm going to make a guess that if this agreement sticks, if Iran finally does feel that its military position has been secured and that it can rely on the Russian air defense system, or at least the Russian supplied air defense system, to defend itself from potential attacks, I would expect that Iran would quietly drop its enrichment program, its nuclear enrichment program, and eventually wrap it up entirely. I think that is a distinct possibility and one that should not be ignored. Anyway, we will no doubt get an awful lot more information about this Iran-Russia treaty over the next couple of days. So far, I have not seen the text. I understand it is 47 provisions. No doubt it will be published over the next couple of hours, and we will be able to see exactly what it says. All the indications so far are that it will correspond very closely with the information I have been provided about it from a source who has his own contacts and his own ability to obtain information in Moscow. So that is what I'm going to say about this agreement. Now, even as the Iranians and the Russians are on the verge of signing off and agreeing a strategic partnership treaty, which is detailed and substantive and which charts a complex way forward. The British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has been in Kiev, where he and Zelensky have signed off on a 100-year treaty of their own. And there's been some voices in Britain, notably the journalist Peter Hitchens, who have been saying that it is absolutely astonishing, completely bizarre, that a British Prime Minister should go to the capital of another country, sign a treaty there which commits Britain to, well, I'm not sure what exactly, for 100 years, and that all of this should take place without any significant public discussion. There's been no discussion of this treaty in Parliament. There's been no discussion of this treaty in the media. I'm not really familiar with its provisions. I don't know what they are. One has heard a fair amount. Probably the Foreign Ministry, the Foreign Office in London will publish it eventually. But it's perfectly true that there's been no discussion in Britain of its provisions. Now, that is partly a feature of the lack of discussion which routinely takes place in Britain about any aspect of the current relationship between Britain and Ukraine. There is astonishingly little debate about any of this, any of the contacts, agreements, assistance that Britain provides to Ukraine. There's been astonishingly little discussion about any of this here in London. But I'm going to suggest that there must be another reason why there's been so little discussion about this particular treaty. And that is because nobody in London takes it particularly seriously. It's not as if anybody really believes that this treaty will have any significance 100 years or 50 years or even 1 year from now. It's a scrap of paper. It's given Keir Starmer something that he can sign whilst he is in Kiev. And of course, the main purpose of Starmer's trip to Kiev was precisely that he would go to Kiev. There's been some criticism of him, surprisingly enough, in some circles in London, that he has delayed his trip to Kiev and has taken longer to go there than the various conservative British prime ministers who preceded him. So Boris Johnson obviously went to Kiev many times, and in fact he still does so from time to time, or so I understand. Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak both made trips to Kiev very soon after they became prime minister. And, well, it was expected that Keir Starmer would do the same. And, of course, he's waited several months to go. Not though I think one should seek any deep explanation for that. Starmer has had many, many things to deal with in the first few months of his premiership, of his government. Many things, as we all know, have not gone well. So it's not surprising that it's not been easy for him to go at particular times. And it's anyway been suggested that he did not want to go, whilst the issue of whether missile strikes on Russia was still unresolved with the Americans. And of course, that was only publicly agreed to or confirmed in November. And that would be another reason why Starmer would have delayed the visit. Well, put all that aside, Starmer went to Kiev. He made all the usual statements about supporting Ukraine, making sure that Ukraine achieves a just peace. When you unpack his words, it's absolutely clear that by a just peace, he means a comprehensive Ukrainian victory over Russia, a victory which everyone can now see is beyond Ukraine's reach. But anyway, he said all of those things whilst he was in Kiev. He signed this piece of paper and he's on his way back to London, as I understand, even as I make this program. It does, again, seem to me that there is this extraordinary disconnect in the world between the substantive discussions that take place when BRICS leaders meet. And it's important to remember that Iran is now a member of the BRICS. And these ritualistic, empty meetings, which have become so much a characteristic of the conduct of foreign policy in the West. When the story of the Ukraine war is finally written, however it ends, Keir Starmer's visit to Kiev will be seen for what it is, no more than a punctuation mark. Just saying. Certainly, it will not be given the weight and importance, obviously, that this meeting between Pezeshkian and Putin and the strategic partnership agreement that the Russians and the Iranians are about to agree, nor will it be given the importance of the Trump-Putin summit meeting, which is now hovering just over the horizon. Now, on that topic, there has been a interesting statement from the Russians about the prospects of the meeting, and they've come from Peskov, Putin's spokesman. He says, this is Peskov, and he was speaking today apparently, he said, our position on the conflict resolution has been clearly articulated by our president, which is to say Putin, and we remain committed to this stance. This stance was laid out in June last year when President Putin gave instructions to the Russian Foreign Ministry. Our stance is consistent, transparent, and well known to everyone. I have nothing to add here. That was what Peskov said, and apparently he said that, or he's reported to have said that, in response to comments, to questions from Russian journalists asking Peskov to respond to comments by the new, or rather the nominated Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who has said that certainly it's important that there should be an agreement, peace between Ukraine and Russia as soon as possible, and that the Russians, as well as the Ukrainians, should be prepared to make concessions. The Russians are saying, well, our position remains the one that we set out back in June when Putin addressed the Foreign Ministry Board. We are not going to change our position. The United States needs to understand and to accept this. Now, over the last 24 or so hours, the Russians have also had to respond to certain comments made by Trump's nominee for US Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. Now, Scott Bessent is reported in the media to have spoken about further sanctions on the Russian oil industry, presumably over and above the sanctions that President Biden authorized a few days ago, just a week ago. Oil sanctions, by the way, which so far, up to this time, appear to have had no effect on Russia's oil export trade whatsoever. Anyway, these comments of Bessent's came alongside an article in Bloomberg which said that there are people who are working within the Trump team looking at possible energy sanctions, further sanctions against the Russian oil industry in order to exert further pressure on the Russians. And, well, Bessent, over the course of his confirmation hearing, was asked questions about this, and he said that he strongly supported, if Trump authorized them, further sanctions against Russia's oil industry. He seemed very open to the idea of those sanctions. Anyway, Peskov was asked about that, and this is what he said. It is no secret that, despite expressing some political willingness for dialogue, the United States administration is unlikely to alter its stance on this issue, that is to say, sanctions. There is no basis for heightened expectations. No substantial changes should be expected. It would be strange if Bessent, as a minister, does not support his president's decision. This is simply unthinkable. If he opposed it, he would just resign. So the Russians are saying, look, we don't know what the Americans are going to do. Ultimately, it's up to Trump. We've become accustomed to sanctions from the Americans. We remember that during his first term, Trump authorized many more sanctions against us, more even than Obama had imposed on us. We've heard all of these words about dialogue and such things from the Americans, from Trump. But if Trump decides to go the way of sanctions, well, so be it. We are ready for it. We will deal with it. We have dealt with all these sanctions in the past. We will find a way to deal with whatever new sanctions Trump imposes. And in relation to our foreign policy and our policy concerning Ukraine, no one should expect or assume that any further sanctions are going to make any difference. Well, you could say that the Russians would say that anyway. After all, if they were to throw up their hands in horror and say it's a terrible, terrible thing if the Americans do impose more sanctions on their oil industry, then that might be seen by many people in Washington. In fact, it undoubtedly would be seen by many people in Washington as a sign of weakness, as a sign that the Russians are indeed afraid of further sanctions, and that might actually encourage some people, perhaps even Trump himself, to authorize those additional sanctions in order to try to gain at least some leverage over the Russians in advance of negotiations. Having said that, it's important to remember that Peskov has experience, history on his side here. We've had 11 years of sanctions against Russia, going all the way back to 2014. The Russians have adapted successfully to all the sanctions that the West has thrown at them. As I've discussed in many programs, it is very likely that this year, 2025, we are going to see a significant reduction in Russia's overall growth rate. That will not be the result of sanctions. It will be the result of Russia's own policies. The Russian government and the Russian central bank want to bring inflation down. They have introduced a very tight monetary policy. There is some indications that they're going to tighten up fiscal policy as well. They want to slow the economy down in order to bring down inflation. They want to do that in order, as they say, to return to a policy of balanced growth. So, given that this is the case, no one should think that there is any axiomatic prospect that because the United States is going to increase sanctions even further, if that's indeed what happens, that is going to result in a slowdown of Russian economic growth this year. This has already been planned, and it will happen because the Russian authorities themselves will it. Unlike some economic commentators in the West, the Russians sometimes understand that sometimes in order to balance things out in your economy, you actually need to lower growth, not constantly keep your foot on the accelerator. So I don't think the Russians are actually especially worried about sanctions. They're probably already looking at what they need to do in order to prepare for any sanctions that the United States, that the Trump administration might impose. They will undoubtedly come up with workarounds, as they have continuously done. These workarounds will be annoying and troublesome, but they will do it. They are far too big and sophisticated a player for people to think that they will not be able to. And of course, there is a risk for Donald Trump if he does indeed go down this route. Because Bloomberg, in that very same article in which was talking about the fact that there are people in the Trump team who are engaging in preliminary discussions and thoughts about what further sanctions on the Russian oil industry could be imposed. Apparently these are at a very early stage at the moment, and Trump has not been personally consulted and is not directly involved. But anyway, Bloomberg says that these people are confronting all of the same problems that the Biden administration confronted when they also looked at the question of sanctioning Russia's massive oil export trade. Firstly, doing so in a way that would seriously dent that trade would raise prices, energy prices, which would feed back to the United States itself and cause inflation pressures there. And secondly, it would also increase pressure around the world, not just in Russia, the incentive around the world, and not just in Russia, to move away from the dollar, to try to find means through new financial and trading structures to circumvent the dollar, so that people and the dollar system, so that countries and individuals and businesses can buy oil without having to worry all the time about what the Americans are saying and thinking, without being obliged all the time to look over their shoulder and worry about the response of the United States. Now, on the first point about taking steps that could lead to increases in energy prices in the United States, as it happens, there's been actually an editorial about this in Washington Examiner, a pro-Republican but generally anti-Trump website. It's not as hardline in its hostility to Trump as National Review is. And Byron York, one of its columnists, is one of the best columnists, in my opinion, in the United States altogether. And he is by no means hostile to Trump. But anyway, Washington Examiner, without, of course, discussing sanctions or anything about sanctions on Russia and its oil industry, makes the point in an editorial today, or rather yesterday, that Biden ends his term with the most expensive average gas prices in America's history. Gas prices, of course, to be clear to British viewers, when Americans talk about gas prices, they mean prices at the pumps, the petrol pumps, at the petrol stations. But anyway, this is what the article says. Gas prices are on the rise throughout the country, and it's only fitting that this is occurring during the last week of President Biden's term. So ever since Biden announced more sanctions on the Russian oil industry, gas prices, that's to say petrol prices at the pump, have been rising in the United States. The Washington Examiner, which supports sanctions and which is deeply opposed to Russia and to President Putin, ignores the fact that this rise over the last week is probably connected with last Friday's sanctions announcement. Never mind. But then read further what it then goes on to say. High gas prices started to plague the country less than 6 months after Biden was sworn in and were a staple of his presidency. Americans have been paying the price literally and figuratively since his first year. As such, when he leaves office on January 20th, Biden will have set multiple records regarding the cost of gas, none of them good. Biden has the dubious distinction of being president when regular gas reached the highest national average price on record in June 2022, when it was $4.9 per gallon. Second, between January 2021 and December 2024, the average cost of a gallon of regular gas in the country was $3.45, the most expensive price during a presidential term in US history. Biden is leaving office synonymous with high gas prices. This is ironic because he regularly tried to escape blame for soaring gas costs during his presidency, but also insisted that the policies in his Build Back Better agenda were helping to lower gas prices. And in fact, we're told that at the moment, the average price for a gallon of regular gas is $3.01. This is a drastic price change during his last days in office. Biden will finish all 4 years with an average gas price of over $3 per gallon, despite gas costing only $2.34 per gallon in his first month as president. Well, as I said, this article in the Washington Examiner makes no connection, none, between the rise of the price of gas, petrol, in the United States during Biden's term and his various sanctions on the Russian energy complex. To be clear, I am not saying that these sanctions were the only reason for elevated prices in the United States over the term of his presidency, but undoubtedly they were a part of that reason. Does President-elect Donald Trump want to continue in his footsteps? Does he want to continue imposing more and more sanctions on the Russian oil industry, which, because of its size and importance in energy markets, will affect the overall price of oil, which will translate to a higher price of gas in forecourts in the United States itself. It's worth pointing out that as soon as Mr. Besson made his comments in his confirmation hearing about further potential sanctions on the Russian energy trade, oil trade, the immediate reaction in the markets was for the price of oil again to go up. So I think that President Trump really needs to make a decision here to repeat again. The Russians will find workarounds. They will always find workarounds. If there is a customer, there will always be supply. One cannot, in a market, particularly a market like the market for oil, choke off supply entirely. Efforts to do so can only increase prices. The Russians will, of course, benefit from those higher prices. And, of course, they can allow the value of the ruble to fall, the exchange rate of the ruble to fall, in order to compensate for any further problems that the restrictions place on them. American consumers, and of course consumers in many other places, will suffer the consequence. And, well, President Trump must have seen what all of those high energy costs, the high prices on the forecourts, did to the popularity of President Biden and of the administration. Does he really want to go there again and suffer the same electoral consequences for himself? After all, he was elected to make the material conditions of life for Americans better, not worse. Just saying. Anyway, there we are. Now, one other party, of course, is going to be looking at all of this with great interest, and that is India. India has now become, as I understand it, the biggest single customer of Russian oil. India buys oil at relatively low and stable prices from the Russians. It uses that oil to develop its economy, and it exports some of that oil, by the way, mostly to Europe, which provides India, the Indian economy, and of course businessmen in India, with a nice income stream. Now, of course, restrictions on exports of Russian oil will affect India. I am not going to say that this is going to be crippling. I think this is wildly overstated. After all, it's overlooked that India only became a major importer of Russian oil relatively recently. But it is the case that the growth rate of the Indian economy has reduced somewhat recently, that the increases in prices, the worldwide inflation, had a political and economic effect in India as well. It probably explains why Prime Minister Modi's recent election victory was not as resounding as had previously been expected. Further restrictions on Russian oil will undoubtedly put additional pressure on oil, the price of oil, the price of petrol in India. For many Indians, that will cause significant problems. India is a country that the United States has been working very hard to build strong relations with. Does the United States really want to do something that will, at best, annoy the Indian government and, at worst, put it in a position where the domestic situation in India deteriorates and where India itself might become increasingly angry with the United States and might even start to distance itself from it. Now, I say that there's been a very interesting article. I say very interesting. The article itself is not interesting, but the place where it's been written is interesting. And that is The Economist, which is one of the most consistently pro-neocon, anti-Russian news sites published anywhere on planet Earth. It has been, on this topic, perhaps the most consistent journal of all. I can remember them publishing pieces which essentially have the same outlook as the pieces it publishes today about Russia, going all the way back to the 1970s. So there's been no real change there. Anyway, this extremely anti-Putin news site is now, but I should say very well connected news site, is now speaking about the dismay, the concern that exists in the West about the fact that India is not prepared to sever or reduce its relationship with Russia. I'm not going to read the article, which you can find on The Economist. Its title is India's Faustian Pact with Russia is Strengthening. Faust, of course, was the German magician who in the 16th century, he's a real person, by the way, there was actually such a person as Dr. Faust. Anyway, the German magician of the 16th century who supposedly made a pact with the devil. Just saying. So India's Faustian pact with Russia presumably means that India here is Faust and Russia is the devil. Very typical of The Economist. Anyway, India's Faustian pact with Russia is strengthening. The gamble behind $17 billion of fresh deals with the Kremlin on oil and arms. And it laments the fact that the Indian government is apparently proposing to host President Putin, who is due to visit India shortly. It agonizes over the fact that despite many Western attempts to try to expand arms exports and business contacts with India, hoping that sooner or later the Indians would wean themselves off their historic friendship with Russia. The Indians show no sign of doing so. It speaks of testy meetings between Indian officials and Western officials, with the Indian officials pushing back hard whenever the topic of India's relationship with Russia comes up. Well, maybe when you read articles like this, you might come away with the thought that hurting India is a price that some people in the West are prepared to pay if that is the price, a price for hurting Russia. Now, if so, all I can say is that the people who advocate that have finally and conclusively taken leave of their senses. India, as most people acknowledge, is a rising great power, though one with many problems. And of course, India has been a linchpin, an essential component part of America's and the West's attempts to create some kind of system of alliances to contain China. Punishing India because it wants to preserve its long-standing relationship with Russia, its oldest and most consistent friend, and a country with which it is anxious to maintain a good relationship, if only because it does not want Russia to align too completely with China, which is simultaneously India's BRICS partner, but also long-term rival. Punishing India because India wants to conduct an independent foreign policy, something it has always insisted on doing ever since it gained independence in the 1940s, and which it is deeply committed to as a rising great power, is likely ultimately only to antagonize India at a time when the Western powers say that they want India's help to contain China. It will change the Indian perspective on the supposed benefits of the relationship with the West. Already, I'm hearing stories coming from India that the Indians have been disappointed overall with the economic relationship with the United States, that they expected more, that they have found that American investments in India have proved less than they had anticipated, that the Americans are more reluctant to share technology with India than the Chinese and the Russians are, that India feels that the United States has promised much more than in fact it delivered in terms of assisting India's development. I think that if the Indians conclude that not only is the United States falling short in doing what it appeared to promise to do, but that it is actually punishing India economically as well, because India insists on maintaining an independent foreign policy, which means maintaining its friendship with its old friends, then I can very easily see how sentiment in India could harden and harden in a way that is not beneficial to the West. But there we are. That, it seems to me, is a further reason why President Trump might be well advised not to seek to increase oil prices, energy prices further, simply by pressing forward with further sanctions. What he decides to do, of course, depends on him. I get the impression that President Trump is continuing to get a great deal of advice from all sorts of people, and I understand that there is frustration in Washington, even from people who support Trump, that the United States has so little leverage going forward into talks with the Russians over Ukraine. But there it is. That is the reality, and it is the reality that needs to be faced. If the other Bloomberg report is true, that Trump does not consider Ukraine an important area, an important to the US's national interests, then I cannot see why he would want to take steps to strengthen sanctions on the Russian oil industry, which would simply heighten prices, put more pressure on American living standards, annoy potential friends like India, prolong the economic recession and the problems that are already afflicting the West, and ultimately undermine his own popularity with his own supporters in the United States. But let me stress again, the decision is his. When the Russians, as for the Russians, as I said, when they say that they will roll with whatever punch, I am sure that they will. After all, recent history confirms that. Now, the Russians are not only saying that they're going to stick to their positions, that they're not going to bend, and that they're not intimidated by the threat of further sanctions on their oil industry. They're also still saying that they're looking forward to the meeting with Trump, and we've heard comments about this from Yuri Ushakov, who is one of Putin's major advisors on foreign policy. And this comes from Interfax, which is, by the way, an independent news agency based in Moscow. It's not controlled. It's not an official news agency in the way the TASS is, but it is well connected and very reliable. And Interfax has this report. The Russian side is calmly expecting a signal from the United States regarding a possible meeting between Russian President Putin and US President Donald Trump. Russian presidential aide Yuri Ushakov said. I would not like to make an impression that Moscow is sitting and waiting for a phone call to be made from Washington. No, we are calmly waiting for Trump's team to take their office, for Trump to enter the Oval Office. Then we will see what happens. And Ushakov then went on to say that preparations for a meeting, in relation to the reports rather, the preparations for a meeting between Putin and Trump are already underway. Ushakov actually contradicted that. He said there are no contacts yet. We have reiterated many times that we stand ready for dialogue. We are calmly waiting for signals. And the meeting, the summit between Putin and Trump would be preceded by closed-door contacts between the White House and the Russian Presidential Executive Office, which is, of course, the office in which Ushakov himself works. And then he said, then matters regarding the further development of dialogue, including a possible top-level conversation, will already be resolved. The president or the head of government who's coming to power is usually the first to make a call. We know that some signals from Washington will come to us at some point. We are ready for them. We are ready to listen to relevant proposals and to respond constructively to them. After taking office, Trump will have a pile of problems that he will deal with, political ones, not just international ones. Where he will start, I do not know. We do not need to agree on major issues first. When certain agreements are reached or are in sight, then it will be time to deal with practical issues as well. Now, that's a very interesting conversation that Ushakov has had, and it took place in a conversation with Pavel Zarubin, who, as I've discussed in many places, is Putin's favorite journalist, Russian journalist, and who is in a kind of second, semi-detached member of Putin's own team. And the way I read this is that Ushakov is actually, the Russians are actually signaling to the Americans, yes, we're as keen for a summit as you, but slow down a little. Before we have this summit, we need to understand what we're going to talk about, what the areas of agreement, potential agreement, and disagreement are. We need a situation where Trump's people and our people, the White House staff and the Russian presidential office, hold discussions. And only then, as these discussions take place, as we work through all of the various issues, only then, really, will it make sense for the meeting between Putin and Trump to take place. And that suggests that the Russians want the meeting to take place, not immediately, but perhaps some weeks after Trump has taken office, after there have been substantive discussions between themselves and Trump's people, with Ushakov making clear that those contacts have not taken place yet. Now, I should say that on the Duran, Glenn Deason and myself recently interviewed the former CIA analyst, George Beebe, who also happens to be one of the leading lights in the Quincy Institute, and who writes extensively and very well for responsible statecraft. And George Beebe, over the course of that discussion, said that in his experience, meetings between leaders, and he does actually have experience here because I said he's been an official of the US government. Anyway, George Beebe made the point that in his experience, the most successful meetings are meetings which have been carefully pre-prepared by officials at lower level before the leaders actually meet. And it looks as if that is also the Russians' view and the one that they're trying to convey to the Americans. They're saying to the Americans, look, we understand how keen you are to meet. We are also, but let's not rush. Let's prepare carefully, because if we don't, it's likely that the meeting will not be able to address substantive issues properly, because nothing will have been prepared in advance, and we will go away without any real points of contact, points of agreement with each other, points that we can agree upon and take further. So anyway, the Russians certainly, however, despite that, prepared to talk. They're looking forward to contact with the Americans. I'm going to make a point here that they're not only expecting to speak to Kellogg, they're expecting to meet with other members of Trump's team. Presumably, they're looking forward to meetings between national security advisors and presidential aides. That we Mike Waltz, presumably, on Trump's side. Not clear who Mike Waltz would meet with on the Russian side. Putin's national security advisor is now Sergei Shoigu, who is, of course, sanctioned and might be a controversial choice to use as an interlocutor from an American point of view. Maybe it could be Ushakov, who is also close to Putin and who has done work in preparing for summits, presidential summits before. But anyway, they presumably want to speak to Waltz, and no doubt they will want to speak to Rubio. So anyway, we will see where all of this goes. But to repeat again, the point I have made many times, it's important to understand that in any negotiations, in any discussions, at this time, it is the Russians who are coming to the negotiations from a position of strength and advantage. They have seen off the sanctions. They have avoided anything that remotely resembles an economic collapse. They've seen their various friendships and alliances solidify and remain stable. They've expanded, they've seen the expansion of the BRICS, of which they are a core part. They've just concluded a new treaty with the Iranians, another potential ally. They're apparently, and this is what Lavrov told us at his press conference the other day, in the process of agreeing some kind of new treaty with the members of the Gulf Cooperation Council, which includes Saudi Arabia and other such countries. We don't know the details of that yet, but Lavrov, over his press conference, said that that is underway. And importantly, Their army continues its advance in Ukraine. And this is what I'm again going to come back to now. Because the situation for the Ukrainians over the last 24 hours has deteriorated drastically further. Now, let me first of all go to what has been said by the Ukrainian military commentator Yuri Butuzov, who I understand, by the way, was formerly an advisor at Ukraine's Ministry of Defense. Now, Butuzov, to repeat again, is a staunch Ukrainian patriot. He is in no way sympathetic to Russia. He is a strong supporter of Ukraine's war effort. But he is somebody who says things as they are, as, by the way, many reporters, both on the Russian and the Ukrainian side, about the war frequently do. As I've had occasion to say many times, the quality of war reporting, both in Russia and Ukraine, over the course of this war, has been nothing short of outstanding. Anyway, a couple of days ago, about 2 days ago, on his Telegram channel, these were the things that Butuzov said. The situation in Pokrovsk and Velikaya Novoselka has spun out of the control of the Ukrainian military command. Commanders of the Donetsk Operational Group and the Khortytsa Strategic Group, these are Ukrainian military formations, have lost their grip. The general headquarters and the Ukrainian commander-in-chief, which is to say Syrsky, are showing an inability to influence what is going on. Butuzov then goes on to complain that Ukrainian infantry are sustaining significant losses in an attempt to slow down the Russians. He complains bitterly about the lack of proper fortifications. He says there's no combat cohesion and planning, or at least what there is defective. And the commanders, the Ukrainian military commanders, continue to set unrealistic goals. We are losing Pokrovsk in a shameful, irresponsible, and incompetent way. Now, the other vocal critic of the Ukrainian war effort, the Ukrainian MP Bezuglaya, has also been out and about in Pokrovsk, in the area of Pokrovsk, and she's now busy saying the same thing. She's been traveling in the area of Pokrovsk. She's been providing video footage, which I want to stress I have not myself seen. But anyway, she's providing long-distance video footage of what she says are the various fortifications and other positions that the Ukrainians established in the area of Pokrovsk. And she laments the fact that these fortifications were apparently occupied by the Russians without any significant resistance. And she says that the situation is deteriorating continuously in the Pokrovsk area in exactly that way, that the bad situation that exists continues precisely as before. Well, those are two Ukrainians. We've had a third commentator who's also been speaking about a deeply critical situation for the Ukrainians in the Pokrovsk area. Now, he's not Ukrainian. He is Julian Röpke, the German journalist who writes for Bild Zeitung. To repeat again, he too is an ardent supporter of Ukraine. To be frank, I find him rather less accurate and comprehensive and thorough in his coverage than I find people like Butuzov. But nonetheless, he is one of the more realistic reporters from the Ukrainian side in the war. And he writes that the Russians have entered two settlements 10 kilometers west of the city. It's not clear which he means, but I gather one of them is Peshania. There is no indication that their previously successful tactic of flanking will not succeed, and that another town, and here he means Pokrovsk, will not be taken by them. And he provides maps. He shows how the Russians continue to advance. He has provided maps which show the Russians now entering Kotlino, the village to the southwest of Pokrovsk, which turns out lies not just on the main roads to the west, and but also railway lines. A main road on the railway lines and the leading westwards, but also the railways there. And anyway, he is aware of how the situation for the Ukrainian troops in the Pokrovsk area is deteriorating. And in fact, over the course of the last 24 hours, we have had a lot more information which casts an even grimmer light on the situation of the Ukrainians trying to defend Pokrovsk. Firstly, since we're talking about Kotlino, there is confirmation that the Russians are indeed fighting inside Kotlino. They have also moved along the road, this road that passes through Kotlino and leads ultimately from Pokrovsk to Dnipro on the Dnieper River. It looks as if the Russians have expanded their control of the road. They've moved further north up the road towards Pokrovsk itself. And there are reports that the Russians have also entered the other village of Udachne, which lies along the same road southwest of Kotlino itself. So we can see that the Russians are very close now to cutting. Well, they have cut this critical communication, the road and railway lines leading this particular road and railway line complex leading from Pokrovsk to Dnipro. The point is, however, that if the Russians consolidate control of Kotlino, they are in a position to move further north, potentially cutting off access for the Ukrainians to the last remaining road leading westwards, which is the E50 road, which is only some distance north of Kotlino. Now, some days ago on TASS said that military sources have told TASS that the Russians already have some kind of control over this road. Probably the Russians are able to shell this road and may have some drones operating over this road. But if they control Kotlino, then they would be able to tighten that control much further, making the road perhaps largely unusable. Just saying. So we could see that the situation in Pokrovsk is indeed deteriorating fast. And by the way, there are now reports that the Russians not only are operating drones inside Pokrovsk itself, using drones to attack Ukrainian troops within Pokrovsk, which is also being shelled and bombed, by the way, by the Russian army, but that the Russians also now are deploying drones along the northern road, the road leading directly north from Pokrovsk, all the way up ultimately to places like Alexandrivka and ultimately Kramatorsk, that the Russians are also able to interfere with this road. And particularly alarmingly, the Russian drones that are operating in this area, in the area of this particular road, the one that leads, as I said, directly north of Pokrovsk. These are fiber optic guided drones. So they are drones guided by fiber optic cables. Now, the Russians have introduced these drones all over the battlefronts. They were first tested out in the Kursk area, but now they're appearing all over the place. They're effectively jam-proof because they get their signals not through radio signals, but through cables, obviously thin cables, light cables. They provide, by the way, extraordinarily clear pictures of their targets. So they have hugely enhanced the quality of drone footage. But the point is that the fact that they use cables, by definition, means that they can only operate over shorter distances than radio-controlled drones can do. Now that, in turn, must mean, or so it seems to me, that the Russians somewhere have crossed the road from Pokrovsk, the main road from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka, south of which are the two villages of Vozvyzhenka and Yelizavetivka that they have captured, that they have recently captured. We have had film recently of Russian troops operating on the road, that they have apparently already cut the road in some place. There was pictures that the Ukrainians themselves provided of some kind of encounter battle on a crossroads on this main road. It's not clear to me where that is, and of course we never saw the complete outcome of the battle. But the fact that the Russians apparently are able to deploy drones, fiber optic drones, along this main road strongly suggests that they're operating, their troops are now north of the road somewhere. In the fields, perhaps, able to deploy drones across the road and interfere with Ukrainian communications and supplies entering and leaving Pokrovsk. A very, very dangerous situation for the Ukrainians indeed. And of course, one that suggests, and these comments by Butuzov and Bezuglaya and Röpke all tell us the same thing, that the Battle of Pokrovsk is approaching a critical point. Now, alongside Pokrovsk, Butuzov mentioned Velikaya Novosilka. There's been further news over the last 24 hours about the battles there. It seems that the small village, or perhaps suburb, of Vremivka, which lies exactly adjoining Velikaya Novosilka to its southwest, has now been captured by the Russians. I've seen actually really rather harrowing footage of explosions all across Velikaya Novosilka. There is clearly some kind of storming operation underway. It's been suggested that Ukrainian resistance in Velikaya Novosilka can only continue for perhaps 2 or 3 more days. That might be over-optimistic. It's been suggested again that the Ukrainian troops in Velikaya Novosilka are actually trapped in this village. We don't know how many there are, but I've heard suggestions that perhaps 1,000 men, that there are perhaps 1,000 men there altogether. The point is, whatever, it's likely that this small town is also going to be captured. Perhaps the Ukrainian troops in Velikaya Novosilka will surrender en masse. We have seen surrenders before, and in fact there are reports that there are more surrenders by Ukrainian troops in various parts of the battle lines taking place pretty much every day now. I can't discuss that. I think it is more likely that at some point over the next couple of days, resistance will break and we'll have the same disastrous story of terrified, demoralized, frightened Ukrainian soldiers trying to flee from Velika Novosilka. They are no longer able to use the roads, using again the fields, the empty fields in the frozen, cold weather. You see lots of film now of snow and ice on the fields across Ukraine, hunted by the Russians and meeting the terrible fate that they will meet as they try to escape. Well, there we go. So, a very grim situation there. Grim situation in Chasiv Yar. There is now footage which confirms that the Russians controlled the refractory plant in Chasiv Yar and the entire industrial district in Chasiv Yar. The Russians have also apparently captured the Novi micro district. It's not clear what exactly is left of Chasiv Yar that the Ukrainians are clinging on to, or what the logic of them clinging on to these places in Chasiv Yar any longer is. And there's footage apparently now of Russian troops on the Toretsk coal mine clearing the Ukrainian troops from the coal mine, which is the only remaining position that the Ukrainians still possess in Toretsk, the whole of the town having fallen under Russian control. And, well, a couple of days ago I mentioned how a place that had once been bitterly fought over, the village of Orekhovo-Vasilyevka, close to Chasiv Yar, has now been captured by the Russians. There were fierce battles for this village before. Now it looks as if the Russians have just been able to walk in. Something similar has just happened in the area of Volchansk in Kharkiv region. There was fierce battles at one time for control of a village to the northeast of Volchansk, a village called Tichy. The Russians have just apparently managed, apparently without meeting much resistance, to capture it. So the Russians continue their advance. And to make a point which I think many people still find difficulty understanding, it is true that we are still talking about battles and fighting taking place east of the Dnieper, and of course in Kursk region, where, by the way, the same Russian fiber optic drones are now very active over Suja as well. So yes, it's absolutely true that the fighting is still located mostly in Donbass, east of the Dnieper River. And I think people make the mistake. They look at a map of Ukraine, they assume that because Ukraine is very big and because most of it is still under Kiev's control, that, well, if the Russians want to advance, once they've broken through all of these lines and defeated the Ukrainian armies there, that, there's still years and years of fighting still left. The reality is that if the Russians reach the Dnieper itself, as I have already many times pointed out, if they reach the Dnieper in central Ukraine, Ukraine's ability to continue to resist beyond that plunges. If the Russians cross the Dnieper, it plunges further. If Ukrainians lose big industrial centers like Zaporozhye and Dnipro itself, and apparently they're now 4 kilometers east of Dnipro region. Obviously the city is some way away. But the point is, the further the Russians move, the more of these big industrial centers they capture, the less capable Ukraine becomes of resisting, sustaining its resistance to the Russians. The Russians grow stronger, Ukraine goes weaker, And after a certain point, the process will accelerate and accelerate very fast. That is how attrition war works. The collapse, when it comes, can be sudden, and at that point, movements can suddenly become very rapid, so that huge distances can be crossed against minimal resistance, because resistance has basically evaporated away. So I don't think that there are the years to play with in terms of this war that many people suppose. Now, one person, interestingly, who seems to get that is Robert Kagan, Victoria Nuland's husband, arch neocon that he is. Now, I've discussed how in a recent program, how a couple of days ago he wrote a long article basically admitting that the Russians have shown extraordinary resilience in the war and that their army is winning the war and all of those things. It was quite an extraordinary, agonized article. You can find it in The Atlantic. The title is "Trump is Facing a Catastrophic Defeat in Ukraine. If Ukraine falls, it will be hard to spin as anything but a debacle for the United States and for its president." Now, the article, as you would expect from Kagan, is a fascinating article. It is full of insight. Kagan is no fool. It is full of insight, and it's also full, packed with all kinds of, well, what he calls factoids, which I would say are ludicrously, almost absurdly wrong. For example, he insists throughout the article that President Putin has declared it his purpose to destroy and take over the whole of Ukraine, and that has been his objective all along. That is absurd. There is no comment of Putin's, none quoted by Kagan himself, which supports that extraordinary claim. He says this about the Istanbul negotiations. Shortly after the invasion was launched, as Russian forces were still driving on Ukraine, Putin could have agreed to a Ukrainian offer to cede territory to Russia, but even then he rejected any guarantees for Ukrainian security. That completely reverses the reality of the Istanbul negotiations. I appreciate that Kagan is citing here an article which makes that same extraordinary claim in the New York Times. But as we know, the question of the security guarantees was agreed. It is there in the draft of the Istanbul Agreement, which both the Ukrainians and the Russians signed. It is simply not true that the Russians did not rejected any guarantees for Ukrainian security. Kagan continues to insist that that telephone conversation between Putin and Trump that was reported some weeks ago after the election actually took place. Putin and his officials have categorically denied that it did. So have Trump and his people. That is not evidence for Kagan that the telephone conversation did not take place. Rather, it is evidence that Putin is, of course, lying, and that Trump weakly accepts this and goes along with Putin's lies. I should say that the persistence in which Kagan insists throughout this article that this telephone conversation really did happen makes me wonder whether he hasn't played some role in spreading the story that it did indeed take place. But anyway, I'm not going to discuss that. But the article, nonetheless, does actually show a better understanding in some ways of the state of the war than you often find in much Western commentary. Because Kagan does acknowledge in the article that Ukraine is losing the war and that it is losing the war catastrophically, and that there is now a real risk, a genuine possibility, that Ukraine will not survive the war. As we've seen comments from Russian officials now, Medvedev and Patrushev, who essentially say the very same thing. So Kagan does understand that. His solution, however, is to just go on doing more of the same. In fact, the entire article is essentially a threat, an attempt to sort of threaten Trump or to scare Trump by telling Trump that, look, if you don't go on supporting Ukraine, if you don't send more and more weapons to Ukraine, if you don't give Ukraine even further military support, then Ukraine will be defeated and the blame will fall on you, squarely on you. You will be to blame for the disaster. So, in order to avoid being blamed for the disaster, what Trump supposedly needs to do is to go on doing all the same things that have been attempted for the last 3 years, keep on supplying more and more weapons to Ukraine in order to, well, it's not clear what. It's not exactly clear what Kagan expects to happen. He talks about putting Ukraine in a better position to negotiate with the Russians, but I can't believe that he genuinely believes that. It seems to me that what Kagan really wants to do, or what he's really, the only thing that he's really thinking about now, is somehow postponing Ukraine's defeat. And he's basically telling Trump, you don't want to be the president who gets defeated. Let's just go on supplying the Ukrainians, postpone the defeat as long as possible, perhaps even indefinitely. Kagan talks about the fantastic possibility that maybe one day the Russian army might collapse, just collapse. And that would mean that, well, in spite of everything, we've won after all. What Kagan is, in other words, offering is another forever war. He's telling Trump, just go on supporting Ukraine. You can't risk the humiliation of the defeat happening on your watch. Just keep on fighting to postpone defeat as long as possible, because that's the only thing that is politically wise for you to do. And that brings me to another article in Responsible Statecraft, this time by Daniel McCarthy. It's come out today, which looks at the failed presidency. I'm sorry to use that word, but I'm not going to draw back from it. The failed presidency, foreign policy presidency of Biden's. The article is, it's over. Biden is last gasp of failed post-Cold War internationalism. And, well, in the article, McCarthy makes the point, the regime change projects of the global war on terror and George W. Bush had been sold to the public as a cakewalk 7 years into the Afghan war, and after 5 years in Iraq, it was clear that Bush and those who followed him had no way out of these conflicts which were being fought, not in order to be won, since victory could hardly even be defined, but simply to postpone defeat. How is that any different from what Kagan and his people are offering. That, I would suggest, is the real trap Trump should seek to avoid. Getting drawn into a forever war against Russia, one in which the Russians hold all the cards, and which, given the advantage on the battlefields that the Russians hold, actually is unlikely to be, in fact, a forever war, but a Russian victory, which, if its terms are not mitigated and negotiated in advance, would be the true disaster for the United States and for Trump's presidency. Well, this is where I finish my program today. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.